Welcome back, guys, to the another SIGcast. This one is part two of the nationalist and liberal revolutions of 1830 and 1848. And again, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully these help you with your notes. You can add some things into the right-hand Cornell note area of your notebook. Also, don't forget to write questions down so we can address these things. So we have the revolutions of 1848, and there's an old saying, and I think Metternich coined the phrase, but when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So 1830, despite going through a revolution in France, there was some rumblings across, in Austria and across the European regions, but Metternich and the boys were able to kind of repress a lot of those. However, not so much in the revolutions of 1848. France sneezes hard, and we're going to see some drastic changes. So while the absolutist regimes continued into the mid-19th century, a growing call for Republican and enlightened ideals continued to grow, as well as calls for unification of nations under the premonition of nationalism. Under its new leader, France would experience some of the fastest economic growth in history. And of course, I'm talking about Louis Philippe. And in the late 1830s, it expanded and improved its road system. In 1842, the government embarked on the construction of a railway network, laying some 900 miles of track. So what you had here is France trying to catch up with the British and their dominance in the Industrial Revolution. Remember, Britain had the advantage of not being involved physically in the Napoleonic Wars. So as Europe was fighting itself and destroying itself, Britain was untouched, and they went through the Industrial Revolution. So you had a increase in demand of heavy industries like coal, iron, steel, and engineering, and so they expanded in turn. For this reason, some economic historians identify the 1840s as a period of takeoff in French industrialization, as I just mentioned. All right. So again, starting in France, early capitalism was really a boom and bust cycle. So under Louis Philippe initially, there was a lot of economic boom, and the good times were really, really rolling. But like everything in history, what goes up must come down. And so what happened was, as the economic growth started to slow and actually started to decline and go into a series of, almost like recession/depressions, those poor economic conditions and famine created a very unhappy situation for the French people by 1848. So what do? Yeah, they call for a new constitution. Remember, Louis Philippe was initially a liberal, and at the time they were totally laissez-faire, that let it be mentality. So, hey, the economy's bad, let it work itself out. But the French were sort of used to getting the government to change to meet their demands and to meet their needs or help out in some capacity. So they called for it, but the king, Louis Philippe, or president, if you want to call him that, refused, stating that he had already taken away the nobles' rights and allowed regular people to participate in the government. He had a minister named Francois Guizot, and Guizot was a typical, economic/political liberal, and he said, we're not going to reform anymore. I mean, we already reformed, so we're not going to change things just because the things are going bad. But that refusal to change it proved to be devastating for Louis Philippe, and it resulted very quickly in Paris being yet overrun by another mob, by the middle and lower class French, and they overthrew the government. All right, Louis Philippe was forced to abdicate. So, in this case, France now established an official republic with a constitution, a parliament, and a president, both elected with complete male sovereignty. Okay, so this is known as the Second French Republic, and it for a while was led by liberal Alphonse Lamartine. I don't know that you need to really know his name, but again, he was allied with the bourgeoisie. There was another guy in the mix of this. His name was Louis Blanc. I think you need to know his name. Louis Blanc, B-L-A-N-C. And he was a socialist thinker who emerged as a leader among the working classes. He proposed national workshops. And these national workshops were created to provide work for the unemployed, so like temporary relief, kind of like in the New Deal in the United States under FDR. You had the Works Progress Administration, the PWA, trying to put people back to work and give them some pride. So another some of the other reforms by Louis Blanc in the Second French Republic were reforms such as abolishing slavery in the empire, a 10-hour workday in Paris, and they also abolished the death penalty. So there were April elections for a new constituent assembly, and these new elections will result in conflict between liberal capitalists and socialists. So again, Louis Blanc was kind of the socialist thinker in France, very popular. So I wanted to just kind of take a step back, and what you have going on here is, yeah, France was now an official republic with a constitution, a parliament, and a president, Second Republic. We've talked about this, but this whole, known as the June Days Revolution, because it happened in June, workers sought a revolutionary republic after Blanc was dropped from the National Assembly. Lamartine dropped the national workshops, and so it wasn't all what it was cracked up to be in June, and people, despite being very optimistic that King Louis Philippe, the constitutional monarch, was out, now you had this new republic, but they didn't like the direction it was going yet again. So this guy Louis Blanc was relieved, and it's kind of like when Jacques Necker was fired by Louis XVI. It brought about the storming of the Bastille. So this is what we call the June Days Revolution. It marked the beginning of class warfare in France, and that's really important. Workers sought war against poverty, and they wanted the redistribution of income. Barricades were put up in the narrow streets to oppose the government forces. This is depicted if you've ever seen Hugo's Les Miserables, all right, Les Mis as it's commonly called, and it's based on this. Yes, it's a musical, it's a great musical, but maybe now if you watch it, you kind of understand the history behind it a little bit. And during this, Lamartine is relieved. General Cavaignac assumes dictatorial powers and crushes the revolt. There's 10,000 people dead, and this is temporarily a victory for the conservatives. We're saying that, hey, we don't want these these liberal reforms. They don't work. Look, these people, they won't be satisfied, and we start to see a new beginning here. Okay, so I'm going to introduce to you a guy named Louis Napoleon. All right, Louis Napoleon, born in Paris, nephew to Napoleon I. Initially, he is exiled to Switzerland and Italy after Waterloo. He was involved in the Carbonari. After Napoleon's death of his son in 1832, he kind of became the claimant to the French throne. He actually attempted a coup in 1840, was arrested and exiled to England. So this guy, actually, in his younger years, was rather socialist. So, to some of the even more liberal ideas of the day, he wanted more reform. And we're going to see he's kind of a chameleon here. So, again, Napoleon's son died in 1832, so his nephew assumed the position of head of the family. So he had name recognition, which is huge in politics. And he was filled with thoughts of glory, and he wanted to capitalize on his famous connection. He was helped by what historians call the Napoleonic legend. It's a fact that Napoleon's reputation actually grew a little bit stronger after his death, and after the memories of millions who died as a result of his policy faded away. So he was kind of romanticized, if you will. Nationalism and romanticism will go hand in hand between 1820 and 1848, and they start glorifying Napoleon from a dictator to kind of a demagogue. All right, people overlook the horrors of his conquering ways, and he was glorified as a time when France was the center of European affairs. Even Louis Napoleon got into the act and wrote books which glorified his uncle and his family name. Now, twice he tried to seize power in a way that would be similar to Hitler's pushes in the 1920s. He tried to do it in Strasbourg in 1836 and Boulogne in 1840. And as I said, from there he was exiled. He had to flee, but he was waiting in the wings for his time to come. And at the time when the government collapsed in 1848, he would wait for his time. Now, it should be known that he was exiled, and he eventually ends up in England. And when he was in England, it was the height of Chartist agitation there. We're going to learn about this a little bit later, but it was a turbulent time in England where a lot of the lower class people were actually calling for more reforms, and so there was a lot of violence. And he actually took a position as a constable and kind of gained a reputation of being conservative and restoring order, kind of like if you know anything about the Wild West in the United States. He's kind of like a Wyatt Earp figure. And what's going to be interesting is this fact is going to contribute to his reputation and popularity in 1848 in France as a candidate of law and order. So it's really interesting. He's got the Napoleonic name, right? He has the writings of his youth where he was kind of sympathetic to socialist ideas. And now he has what the conservatives like as being kind of this law and order guy that's going to keep stability. So really interesting political dynamic here. He did play it both ways. He was a friend of the common people and yet wanted law and order. Some said his sympathy was for the common man was a trait he inherited from his gentle mother, the daughter of Josephine. But, you know, again, guys, we're going to learn about a topic called realpolitik. He's a chameleon. Remember, this is the birth of a modern politician, trying to be everything to everybody. So he returns to Paris in 1848. He's elected to the National Assembly. And when those revolutions that I had described earlier in 1848 died down in France, there were 4 candidates for president. The Constituent Assembly wanted a strong executive, and they wanted a president to be elected by universal male suffrage. Remember, the change was all men were able to vote. So in 1848, after the first upheaval, the French were asked to vote for a new president. And whose name was on the ballot? Who was recognized the most? You guessed it. So he becomes President Louis Napoleon, seen by voters as a symbol of stability and potential greatness. And you look at the votes as they were counted, it wasn't even close. This was the guy that had been in power, only received 18,000. This guy received, this is the general, conservative general that was responsible for the death of putting down the revolts and killing 10,000 people. He finished second, but as you can see, not even close. So how did he become President of France? The right man at the right time, guys. Romanticism was sexy, liberalism was growing, he was conservative, and he was nationalistic. So all of those things are going to appeal to all of them. They appeal to conservatives with nationalism and law and order. And this may be puzzling, but you know, really, it's just a dynamic of the times. You know, nationalism was liberal, it was idealistic, it was democratic, sometimes radical, but this is that era of what we call realpolitik, okay? People manipulated nationalism and liberalism to gain their own ends. And 20th century proves that nationalism wears many masks. Napoleon, the first Napoleon, combined national devotion with authoritarian rule, you know, take people's rights away in the name of nationalism. Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon will become Napoleon III, revives this and extends it with authoritarian nationalism, which is the model for later authoritarian rulers. So this guy is going to be admired by afar by the likes of Hitler and Stalin. So there's a synthesis moment for you. And as I said, law and order, he was dedicated to the law and order in England. So, you know, he was on the outside looks as an enemy to socialism and radicalism. And that really made him favorable to the conservative classes, the church, the army, property owners, and even in some cases business owners. So Karl Marx said the fear of the middle class and property owners against socialist radicals and urban workers was the key. They wanted government that protected them. So again, he's a tough cop with a big stick, and you know, he did gain that experience in England, but again, really a chameleon. How did he appeal to the liberals? Again, nationalism, name recognition, romanticism, bring back the good old days. Voters were swayed by the Napoleonic legend and greatness and stability, and desired to have another Bonaparte in control. Had a positive program, as he called it. He wrote 2 works earlier. They had Napoleonic ideas, but he also advocated the elimination of property while in prison. He said the government should represent the people and help them economically, which was kind of a socialist idea, and parliaments and political parties were not the answer. He felt that politicians were very, controlled by special interest groups who only served their own interests. They only stirred up the class hatred and were not interested in actually helping the poor, only themselves politically. So he felt a strong authoritarian national leader could serve all, direct democracy, universal male suffrage. This system would not be corrupted, as in his words, by politician and legislative bodies. So again, synthesis alert. In the wake of failed revolutions, the end justify the means finally catches on. Romantic impromptu revolts to bring about change, about in an age of realism, realpolitik. This will be reflected in the politics, policy, and art of this era, changed by real and practical means. They were impromptu, but they were not really well planned out. And as you can see, other European nations will follow suit with revolts in 1848.